Now, probably you hear me now, right? Hello.
Gavin, do you have a PowerPoint or anything like that, or it's okay? Yeah.
No PowerPoint. You have to basically just.
No, that's better. I prefer. I mean, less technology is better, and your speech maybe will prove it anyway. So I don't know. So technology complicates things. So it's okay. I mean, if you had the PowerPoint, then we need to make you a co-host so that you could share your speech. That's why I'm asking. Yeah, let's wait for another minute. Yeah, we are on live now, so on YouTube. People can also watch it over there. And if they ask questions on the YouTube website, then our ECPS colleagues will just copy and paste the questions to the chat here so that we can see it. Okay, let's start. Hello, everyone. I am Ihsan Yilmaz. I am based at Deakin University, Melbourne, Australia. I am also a non-resident senior fellow at European Center for Populism Studies. We started this talk series on sharp power last week, and our first speaker was Christopher Walker from the Endowment for Democracy. And now we have our second speaker, who is a very eminent scholar on these issues: technology, information warfare, sharp power, and so on. And he's a senior fellow at the International Affairs Program, Technology and International Affairs Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Gavin Wilde applies his expertise on Russia and information warfare to examine the strategic challenges posed by cyber and influence operations, propaganda, and emerging technologies. He previously served on the U.S. National Security Council and in analytic and leadership roles in the U.S. intelligence community for 15 years, including as a co-author of the IC assessment of Russia's interference in the 2016 presidential election, US presidential election. He's also an adjunct lecturer on information conflict at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. His topic is today Russia's information warfare as regime insecurity. And over to you, Gavin, now. And after his speech, we will have a Q&A session. And also, please note that we are recording this session, and they will be available on the ECPS's website. So you can. Thank you. Over to you, Gavin.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about these issues that I've been studying for quite some time. As I was speaking with you and your folks about Russian projection of sharp power, this topic seemed to fit within the theme. And so I would describe, I think I would start by describing Russia's posture in the information space, which is to say its propaganda behavior and in cyberspace as aggressively, imperialistically, and conspiratorially defensive. And I'll outline a little bit of a few of the reasons why here today. But by reviewing some of their foundational strategy documents over the past couple of decades and practicing some strategic empathy for Moscow, I think we can see that their notion of information security, or what they call information security, is inextricably and intrinsically linked to regime security and legitimacy, and it's born of something of a siege mentality. Consequently, rather than perceiving Moscow's behavior in the information space as expansionist or an expression of Moscow's foreign policy, I think there's a way that we can look at the Kremlin's information warfare instead through a domestic and regime security prism, as much a counterinsurgency as an expeditionary strategy, less an escalation and more a projection. George Kennan, the famous American diplomat, in his also famous X-telegram, suggested an interesting duality to the idea of perceived threats to the Soviet state, in that they serve simultaneous destabilizing and legitimizing functions. Kennan wrote that it lies in the nature of the mental world of the Soviet leaders, as well as in the character of their ideology, that no opposition to them can be officially recognized as having any merit or justification whatsoever. Such opposition can flow, in theory, only from the hostile and incorrigible forces. Now, Kennan went on to note how, as long as the remnants of capitalism existed in Russia, they could be blamed for the need to maintain some form of dictatorial society. But as those remnants were liquidated, and thus no serious opposition to the Kremlin was then possible internally, it became necessary to justify retention of the dictatorship by stressing the menace of capitalism abroad. And so I would submit to you here that Kennan's words ring as true for information under Putin as they did for capitalism under Lenin and Stalin. Now, much of the faith that the Soviet leaders later imbued upon information warfare stems from this notion of individual and societal and social malleability that's inherent to Leninist thought. After overthrowing the Tsar in the October Revolution of 1917, the ideological leaders of the Bolshevik movement took upon themselves the task of molding what they called the new Soviet man. Leon Trotsky planned to experiment in societal construction, while Lenin set as a prerequisite for the revolution's survival complete control over all sources of information. Later on, as advanced technologies began to capture both American and Russian imagination during the atomic age, Soviet intellectuals became seized with the prospects for cybernetics, which is essentially the study of control and feedback in complex systems, particularly those that involve human and machine, and its potential social, economic, and military applications. For example, Soviet Admiral Axel Berg propounded on the promise of the new discipline in the early 1960s, and he said, "There are no unknowable phenomena, only unknown ones. Likewise, there are no uncontrollable processes, only those in which the complexity of the task is not yet matched by the methods and means for its solution." So you can see this systemic rejection of any notion that a network might emerge organically or unsanctioned was emblematic of Moscow's future approach to information and technology writ large. Moreover, the tendency to apply this mechanistic rubric to the complexities of human development and cognition soon permeated Soviet planning. As a 1937 article in the state-run newspaper Pravda stated, quote, "We know that engines do not stop by themselves. Machine tools do not break down on their own. Boilers do not explode on their own. Someone's hand is hidden behind these events." Incidentally, this sentiment enabled Soviet leaders to abdicate responsibility for major failures, both economic and military. Such insecurity likely also underpinned the Soviet KGB's faith in the utility of so-called active measures, the covert tradecraft designed to sculpt foreign perceptions through whatever means necessary, proxies, agents, frauds, and even incitement to violence, perfected by the agency's first chief directorate, which had a dedicated department for spreading disinformation. Dedication to information warfare did not die with the Soviet Union's 1991 collapse, of course. Rather, in the mid and late 1990s, Russian debates about security in the information sphere appeared to center around internal instability, former Soviet republics' growing integration with the West, and a deep desire on the part of many officials, as well as many Russians themselves, to reassert an idea of national unity and greatness. Much of Moscow's thinking about security in the so-called information age found its roots in the search for explanatory power amid the disorienting and tumultuous post-collapse period of the 1990s. In its worst expressions, strategic culture in Moscow gravitated towards the compensatory myth, as Russian pollster Lev Gudkov calls it, of a glorious past disrupted by external forces. We see the culminating effect of this mentality being wielded against Ukraine at this very day. Now, domestically, then President Yeltsin and his political rivals wrangled for control over television and newspaper coverage, while military theorists drew what they perceived to be lessons from US and NATO performances in the Persian Gulf and the Balkan Wars, concluding that information warfare was changing the very nature of the threat to Russian national security. According to American military expert Timothy Thomas, Russian thinkers considered the population and the armed forces to be extremely vulnerable to foreign information operations, and the requirement to counteract this information or psychological capability of the enemy took on increasing importance over the years. The transition from the Soviet heyday of propaganda and active measures to the Putin era of digital subversion did not take place in a vacuum. Each step along this path evolved into what Russia scholar Robert Horvath describes as, quote, preventive counter-revolution, and was guided by meticulously documented strategy. Since Vladimir Putin's ascendance to the Russian presidency in December of 1999, there's been no single cohesive doctrine for information warfare. Rather, the Russian government has published a series of information security, foreign policy, military, and other doctrines and strategies, which both set priorities for the Russian information apparatus, as well as collectively lay out how the Kremlin thinks about information and the internet, and competition and conflict within that space. The components of Russian thinking in the Putin era illustrate a comprehensive view of information security that goes far beyond the technical and reflects an increasingly conspiratorial belief that external actors are weaponizing the modern information space to undermine the regime at home. The dominant threads linking 2 decades worth of these documents together are thus wariness of dependence on foreign media and technologies, domestic socio-political instability being spurred by an uncontrolled information environment, and Western militaries surpassing Russia's capacity to exploit advantages in both of those areas. Now, in this regard, Russia's cyber behaviors seem designed as much to insulate the regime from external influence by creating a technological and psychological buffer zone around the nation. As scholar Biljana Lilly recently outlined in her book, Russian Information Warfare, this has resulted in a pattern of coercive cyber operations aimed at the former Eastern Bloc and disruptive operations towards the West. Now, the tone of these documents are overwhelmingly defensive and paranoid. But it's only been recently that there's been any real allusion to offensive capacity on Russia's part. For example, the 2021 national security concept stated that Russia's enemies include foreign tech companies, quote, spreading unverified information, and, quote, a distorted view of historical facts. In response, the Russian government was tasked not only with providing information security at home, but also bringing, quote, reliable information about the Russian Federation's domestic and foreign policy to the Russian and international community, ensuring the development of forces and means of information confrontation, presumably via military and intelligence means. Now, these strategies were complemented by a raft of legislation over the previous decade, which was designed to impose what Moscow calls sovereignty over the infrastructure, the content, and the data traversing Russia's sovereign information space. While nowhere near as effective or sophisticated as China's Great Firewall, Moscow's splinter net or RuNet is the culmination of these efforts. So what does all of this mean for us as practitioners or scholars or civil society organizations? I think there's three things that I would underscore. Insofar as the Kremlin continues to insist upon a view of information as foremost a battlefield for regime solvency, I would argue that analysts and policymakers must, number one, accept that Moscow's insecurities about the information environment, however profoundly misguided, are nevertheless genuine and deeply entrenched. So while the belief that the US-led West is concertedly deploying covert information operations to destabilize Russia and its neighbors may be a mere cynical posturing in some circles, it is foundational canon in the inner circle. Both overt messaging and covert activities should thus be conducted advisedly, as they will certainly be perceived and portrayed accordingly by the Kremlin. Meanwhile, disabusing Moscow of this notion is likely to be a generational project that is unlikely to bear fruit under a Putin or Putinist regime. Secondly, I would argue that we should perceive and portray Russian information operations less as expressions of strength on the international stage, more as signals of vulnerability on the domestic front. Reflexively casting the US and the West as the primary focal points or the antagonists of Russian activity in the information space risks legitimizing Moscow's framing and lending more credit to Russia's strategic thought and prowess on the international stage than is likely warranted. And lastly, we should continue to explore the relationship between Russian information operations abroad and Russian insecurity at home, as indeed there appears to be some correlation. This area is ripe for further research and policy analysis. And using history as a guide, the entities and tradecraft Moscow uses to subjugate the information environment in Russia, particularly as failures in the war on Ukraine threaten to spur fissures online, these can likely serve as an early warning mechanism for how such capabilities will eventually be operationalized abroad. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions or discuss any points.
Thank you. That's great. Any questions? Okay, let me start. First, I have a comment to make. While I was listening to you, I couldn't stop myself comparing Russia to Turkey. And if we just replace the word Russia with Turkey, I could easily make the same speech. I don't, of course, have your expertise on these matters, but these social, psychological, political, psychological issues are so similar. This victimhood mentality, siege mentality, anti-Western conspiracy theories, and to a certain extent, inferiority complex, this paranoia, and the security-focused approach to foreign affairs, and also obsession with the domestic issues, domestic internal enemies who have been used or potentially could be used by the Western powers as pawns or puppets, fifth column, etc. So there are so many similarities. It's surprising. And also the nostalgia for the lost empire and the glorious days. And Trump was saying the similar thing, but his nostalgia just goes back to 2 years ago. He says, America was great 2 years ago. It was so glorious. He used the term. I mean, that's just a textbook case anyway. So this nostalgia for the lost empire and blaming everything, what happened, what went wrong on the West, disregarding the internal issues, etc. So they are so similar. But in the Turkish case, there is also, I am asking this because I don't know about Russia as much as I do about Turkey. So in the Turkish case, coupled with this defensive rhetoric, there is also this aggressive and also irredentist tone saying that these countries, they were part of the Ottoman Empire and this neo-Ottomanism. So there is this aggressive tone. And this is also related to Turkey's both soft power and sharp power activities in the Caucasus, in the Middle East, and in the Balkans, and also almost in all Muslim majority countries. So Turkey has been doing this, especially this anti-Western rhetoric and narrative, blaming the West for everything, and so on. And I wonder if the Russian experts or pundits or people who disseminate these messages and narrative also have been engaged with this assertive rhetoric, this expansionism, etc.
So I think the closest analog would probably be this idea of what they call the Russian world, which is essentially I guess you could call it an ideology that submits that ethnic Russians, wherever they may be, that the Russian state has some kind of responsibility for protecting their interests wherever they might be found around the globe. Typically, that usually means on Russia's periphery. And so you will see, you've seen over the last probably 10 years, a big push to protect the Russian language as it's spoken, particularly in the Baltics or in Ukraine, certainly. And to also kind of maintain the imagery and the historical or ahistorical, as it might be, memory of World War II and keep those themes alive as kind of a galvanizing influence or a unifying influence with Russian speakers abroad, in hopes that that can sustain Moscow's geopolitical influence abroad. I think where that runs into problems is, again, where that narrative cuts against probably local memory of the Soviet occupation, certainly of the German occupation, but also the Soviet occupation in World War II and afterwards. And certainly where it seems to have, a sharp edge to it, as it were, and kind of an aggressive or expansionist edge to it. So I think that's, again, Ukraine kind of provides a culminating event. The war in Ukraine right now is really the culmination, I think, of the most violent expression of that sense of parochialism or paternalism over any Russian speakers or Russian influence abroad, irrespective of whether those individuals consider themselves to be part of the Russian world or not.
Thank you. I have a follow-up question, but I will stop. Fan, you have a question?
Yes, I do have a question. I think Martin raised his hand first, so maybe let's start with Martin first.
Yes, I saw it, but I thought it's just all males, so ladies first, even though it wasn't a lady first, but I am trying my best.
Okay, thanks, Ethan.
Sorry, Martin.
Sorry about that, Martin. I actually have a couple of questions, but I'll ask the one I'm mostly interested in. Likewise, I cannot stop comparing Russia to China, especially in terms of internet governance and the development of the internet in Russia versus in China as well. So I think one of the questions that I did want to ask is, I was wondering whether you'll be able to, talk a little bit more about the historical trajectory of the internet development in Russia and in comparison to the United States as well, like whether how Russia's internet is different to the internet development or to the neoliberal kind of cyber libertarianism that guides the internet development in the United States. And particularly, I'm more interested in the idea of internet governance, for example, in China. One of the dominant app that was developed in Russia and has been widely used by Russian people is VK, the messenger application. So I'm just wondering, what is the governance guideline of that application, and how that application or other Russian self-developed application will be able to regulate the kind of speech domestically and also internationally or transnationally. And yeah, so that's my question. Thanks, Gavin.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and it's pretty it covers a lot of territory. I think probably one of the biggest animating features of the kind of conspiratorial view of the internet comes from the fact that the US certainly, and then the West, and then the globe kind of reached to this period of internet ubiquity in the mid to late 90s, which coincidentally was kind of the low point of a lot of modern memory for Russians. This was a period of economic collapse and the late Yeltsin era where there was a lot of inner turmoil, and so there's a sense of aggrievement and resentment about how quickly the US and the West were advancing technologically at this kind of historical low point for Moscow. And so that paints a lot of what came after. Unfortunately for the Kremlin, however, the Russian economy in the early aughts kind of got they caught up in some regard, and the Russian economy got entangled with the global economy, including through the internet, I think to a degree that it could not undertake the same kind of project that China did early on, to kind of set up the infrastructure for a sequestered internet portion. My understanding is that China undertook those efforts far earlier on in the development of the internet, and Russia simply became too deeply entrenched in the global internet to simply extricate itself easily. Now, over time, more recently, I think certainly the Russian regulator Roskomnadzor and the telecommunications providers are still undertaking a lot of efforts to seal off VPNs and to kind of they blocked at least 7,000 plus websites. There's still a lot of effort to kind of hive off the Russian portion of the internet. I just don't know that it's as advanced at this point as the Great Firewall, and I would say at this point, some of the degree to which Russia's internet section is isolated is as much a byproduct of Western withdrawal from the Russian market as from Moscow's own moves to censor or seal off the internet. And my understanding from speaking with folks that are still in Russia is that by and large, while some sites are blocked, there's still some degree of ability to use VPNs to access a lot of blocked content. With regard to kind of the way they view information security, I think the main thing that I always point to is that where in the West we tend to think of internet and digital security as network out, Moscow begins from cognitive out. And so that's why I think whether it's in multilateral fora like the UN group of government experts or the open-ended working group on cybersecurity issues, Moscow, as I believe China does, believes in this sense of sovereign space, that not just data, ones and zeros that traverse their territory, but also the ideas and the content that traverse their territory, that Moscow as a government has the right and the sovereignty over that content, and thus that's where the discussions around internet freedom and that sovereignty tend to break down.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Gavin.
Yes, thank you, Martin.
Yes, thank you very much, Gavin, for what you've been explaining so far. It's been super interesting. I had a question about so a lot of Russian misinformation occurs, like on the internet, occurs through the vector of its media outlets. So like Russia Today, but also other parts of the Russian media sphere. I just wanted to hear your thoughts about the initial response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine was the banning of some of these media channels across Europe, which was criticized in some circles, very restrained circles, but still some circles, as like working only to insulate Russia's media sphere from the outside. What are your thoughts whether or not this was like sort of a measured response to the challenges posed, or do you think there was more to do or is more to do with regards to combating like media propaganda and misinformation?
Wow, yeah, that's a great question. So I struggle with this as well. On one hand, I think there's and post 2016, I think Washington, D.C. writ large is still grappling with this question of the degree to which foreign media influence, when it's unabashedly government, kind of state-run, openly and unabashedly, and when it's clearly and demonstrably untruth that's being propagated, I think at the very least needs to be made clear and labeled as such, that you're hearing the opinions of a state, of a government, to the extent to which it should be, banned or shut off. That's a tougher question, and I think it's one that democracies certainly have to wrestle with, and have done certainly in World War II era, struggled with this as well. The U.S. Foreign Agents Registration Act is kind of born of that very fear of at the time, influence from the Hitler-run Nazi Party kind of permeating media space in the U.S. What I will say is that I think it's clear from watching RT or those kinds of outlets that it's propaganda at work, and it reflects, as I said, Moscow's general sense that information is inherently wieldable, that if I just have enough reach and amplification, that I can somehow mold a society. That certainly worked internally in their view, and now it's turned outward. I take issue with that philosophy. I don't think it's necessarily true. I think there's got to be a lot of preconditions for that kind of approach to work, if at all. But I also, again, I think it reflects this sense of insecurity. And I also am wary of the idea that any information outlet is merely either being weaponized by some entity or is able to be weaponized. I think that's a dangerous space for democracies to kind of back themselves into in response to some of these outlets. And so I think in general, I'm all about transparency and a kind of human right to credible and true information. All of that said, I worry that as democracies, we kind of, in trying to defend ourselves against the onslaught of disinformation and propaganda, we inadvertently talk ourselves into this idea that information is inherently wieldable like a weapon, because I think humans and societies are much more complex than that. And so in that regard, I think there's certainly some drawbacks to closing off avenues of information. But I think that's certainly the right of sovereign states to kind of take measures to ensure that their population understands that this kind of outlet, certainly RT, is nothing more than, is at its core the expression of the Kremlin. That also said, I think a lot of times we view Russian propaganda as being very top down, which I think in some regards it is, but in other senses, as you've seen with the renewed incursion into Ukraine from February, there's a lot of just toss, and certainly with MH17 in 2014, the shoot down over Ukraine, this tragedy, there's a lot of just simply spraying narratives to see what sticks. And being very entrepreneurial, I think. So, certainly I imagine there's talking points that are kind of generally provided from on high. But in another regard, I think a lot of these propaganda artists are very astute at merely experimenting and being entrepreneurial and seeing what narratives take hold. And at the very minimum, so polluting the information environment that no one can really trust much anyway. I think where the Kremlin can't find a narrative that sticks, they will certainly settle for the idea that no narrative gets to stick at all.
Great. Thank you very much. That was super interesting.
Thank you, Gavin. Thank you, Martin. Herkül Bey?
Yes, first I want to thank Professor Wilde. I enjoyed the presentation, and I have a comment rather than a question. When listening to you, just as Professor Ihsan Yilmaz, I felt I was listening about the case, the Turkish case, There were so many similarities. And actually, Mr. Yilmaz expressed what I wanted to say myself too, that's the similarities, there are so many. I want to comment on that regimes like communist regime, dictatorial regimes, names like that are not of such a big importance. The practice is much more important. We have the Turkish case, for example, where is officially a democracy, a member of NATO, a member of the Western world, and still we have so many similarities with regime of communist regime and dictatorial Putin regime. So I mean, the name we give to a regime is not so important. The understanding that there is a political power that knows what is right, what is good for the people, what they are supposed to listen to and learn and control the information is irrelevant from the regime itself. It can we may have the same case, say, I hope not, but in any democratic country of the Western world, we have some signs of this, there are some authoritarian understanding of of treating the people as if they are students, that they have to learn something, and especially not to learn some bad habits or things like that. Still, I am trying to think trying to find a difference between, say, the Soviet regime and present-day Turkey. I think the only thing that I think is different is that in the Soviet case, we had a group of people following an ideology, trying to secure the victory of the ideology. And they also had quite a big support from people outside Soviet Union with the same ideals. In the Turkish case, I don't know what the regime is trying to protect. I mean, what is trying to save. It ends up as if it is trying to save one person only. And I think this is quite a big difference between Soviet regime and present-day Turkey. I don't know if you agree with me, but the parallel is, there are many similarities, but there are probably one or two differences too. And this is what I wanted to add to this nice meeting.
Well, thank you. No, I think I certainly agree with you that first off, that regime types and categories are certainly helpful in some regard, but I think you're spot on that institutions and values are whether they be democratic or illiberal, certainly come to express themselves sooner or later in the behavior of nations. And we, in the United States, we've certainly, I think, reached a greater appreciation for the fact that no kind of governance type of branding simply proceeds on its own inertia. It has to be cultivated, it has to be nurtured, and is really the byproduct of the people that we entrust with authority and power to govern us. And so I think you're absolutely right there. I also think there's common threads throughout, call it illiberal or authoritarian impulse, that we can see that, as I understand, there are through lines certainly over history and across different countries throughout time. I think, to my understanding at least, what's rather unique about the Soviet experiment was, I dare call it, a sense of religiosity. It was from Lenin and Trotsky. Certainly, there was just this sense that there needed to be total control, not only of what content there was, which ranged from not just newspapers, but socialist realism had to permeate literature, sculpture, dance. They needed it to be reflected in every activity. And when you compare that to a lot of kind of religious movements, it really does, there seem to be similarities there. The degree of kind of permeation into every facet of life. And I think with the collapse of that certainly in 1991, a lot of certainly the leaders, but the population, this was such a devastating loss of sense of collective identity that, when coinciding with what I think in the United States we would consider the 90s were very prosperous, were very innovative, were very kind of triumphant, those two historical eras were such a kind of perfect storm that touched off a lot of the behaviors and the attitudes that I think we're now seeing play out. And so in that regard, I think that's probably one of the more unique aspects of the Russian or Soviet experience.
Thank you.
Thank you both. Kainat?
Yeah, thank you. Gavin, thank you for this interesting talk. I think it has been very helpful to understand how not only Russia disseminates information, but how it views the whole idea of information and citizenship. So I have a question, and it's linked to how you began the presentation. You said that since the October Revolution, the Russian state has been trying to create an ideal citizen. And when you keep that in view, we see that despite all these efforts, the Russian people are not a unified group. For example, in the case of the recent invasion of Ukraine, we see that internally there are protests against the invasion, and then there are also protests in favor of, the president and this invasion itself. So, in light of this, how are the Russian people within Russia and outside the country responding to whatever propaganda the government has been targeting at them?
Oh, that's a great question. I think there's certainly some antipathy towards the current war. I think most of the expressions of opposition came more in light of the partial mobilization that the Kremlin announced, because that really, I think, gave a lot of certainly mothers the sense that their sons might be wrapped up in this. But even there, I think there was, at least for myself and a lot of my colleagues, I think there was a disappointment in the amount of passivity. And I think, the term learned helplessness is one that we use a lot with regard to the average Russian, which is that there's not many avenues for the Russian opposition to the extent that it exists as a coherent unit, which I think is highly in doubt. It's very difficult to see what avenues or what shape it can take. And I think the most effective opposition to the war, to the extent it's even possible, will have to come from intra-elite splits about the future of Russia, because I think that stems not only from the fact that there's been so much repression over the past 2 decades, kind of this gradual tightening of any opposition forces and crackdown of any of its leadership, but also the very kind of paternalism that derives from the very era that you outlined. Bear in mind that it was only just over 100 years ago that the October Revolution took place, and at that time the vast majority of the Russian population was peasantry. It was illiterate, and so that was part of this idea that Lenin undertook, that we're going to shape this highly educated and industrialized nation. And in a lot of regards, the Bolsheviks and then later Stalin were very successful at that, at rapidly industrializing and rapidly educating and advancing this very prosperous society. However, within that system, there's also this sense of paternalism, where the relationship between, let's say, the governed and the government is very, very different from the way that certainly in democracies we relate to ourselves and our leaders and hold them to account. So there's already a lot of barriers to kind of, I would say, at the risk of sounding essentialist, but I think in general, as a general idea, the relationship between the average Russian citizen and, say, the Kremlin is more one of kind of passivity, certainly in the Putin era. And so that makes it, I think, very difficult to kind of cultivate a lot of hope that the population is going to be kind of this grassroots opposition to the war. I think far more realistic are going to be some conscientious objectors among the elite. But even that, I would say, I would asterisk that with the fact that Putin's kind of control and the degree of support that he enjoys even within the elite seems rather absolute. And it's difficult for me to foresee any scenarios where it gets either much better with Putin or frankly much better with a successor from the current inner circle, because they're very convinced of the justness of their cause, however brutal it's proven to be.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. Pan, you have another question? Good.
Yes, I have another question. Thank you very much, Gavin, for the wonderful talk and also all the detailed, insightful explanations in response to the questions. I think I kind of want to get some of your insights on Russia firing missiles to Poland earlier today or later last night, depending on which time zone you are. And I was wondering, like, there are some assumptions from the media that it is planned, and some media say that it's, it's an accident. So I'm just wondering, like, what do you think was the intention of Russians that move, and what kind of misinformation, disinformation, or fake news, or Russian government support propaganda that we might see in the next, for example, in the next weeks, and in what kind of form? Thanks.
Yeah, so at present, very early in the morning on 16 November, I think it's still unclear, at least to me, whether this was a deliberate move, whether this was accidental, whether this was an errant Russian missile, Russia-fired missile, or an errant Ukrainian defensive missile. I think we just don't have all the facts as of yet. As far as the reaction, I think it's fair to predict, and I think it's already taking place, there's going to be a reflexive move by Russian propaganda outlets to claim that this is a provocation, that this was undertaken by the Poles or the Ukrainians themselves, that were under the puppetry of the UK or the US or NATO. I think that's a reflex that they instinctively revert to. Which is of the same kind of type that we saw post in 2014 with the shoot down of a Malaysian airliner, and so I think that's probably a predictable move on their part. That at the very least buys them time to come up with something else and something better in their mind. As the facts begin to emerge, I think they will pivot off of whatever the facts suggest. There will then be a pivot towards another narrative and another narrative. The main thing is to keep in their mind the focus off any. There's no legitimate universe in which it could possibly have been us or, and again, I think that's just learned behavior. It's reflexive on the part of Russian propagandists, and they have a very, the 22 years into Vladimir Putin's reign, I think these guys have a great sense of kind of knowing what will please the boss and knowing how to spin events in a way that at least keeps options open for Moscow. And so that's my sense of what's probably going to happen, irrespective of which facts come out from investigators in Poland. There's going to be obfuscation and deflection and yeah.
Thanks, Gavin.
Thank you, Gavin. And yes, I think our timing is perfect. We have no more questions, and yeah, it's a few more minutes left, but we can stop here. And we had another great talk today, which I enjoyed a lot and I learned a lot. We will continue having our conversations. Of course, it's a very complicated issue, as Gavin underlined. And we will have this session on YouTube very soon, so that people who couldn't join us today because of the time differences and many other reasons they will be able to watch this. And next week around this time, we will have another great speaker, hopefully. And until that time, thank you. Thank you very much, Gavin. Again, thank you.
Thank you so much. All the best of luck in your work.
Thank you.